Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk. So let's talk the miracle of the seventh-day ox. Today we're going to get into chapter 17 and see where it takes us today. I hope that you are in fact enjoying this book with me. And after this book, I've got another special series that's coming up, so I hope you're ready for that. But let's go ahead and jump into chapter 17. Chapter 17, narrated by Stefanie Pettis. The next day, Nikolai managed to get to his feet and limped back to the barracks. He couldn't go to the mess hall to eat yet, but Yuri brought him some broche and Russian black bread. Nikolai tried to thank the guard, but Yuri waved off the gesture as though he didn't want to hear it. By Wednesday afternoon, Nikolai thought he could probably work some if he hadn't had to lift anything too heavy or walk too much. No one was following him around to see if he worked, but he felt that it would be some kind of statement to the warding if he could get a few hours of work in before sunset Wednesday. The week was half over, and the Sabbath was looming on his weekly horizon. It would come, and when it did, he had a feeling that the warden would put him back in the box. It was a battle of wills now between him and the warden. It appeared that the warden wanted to win this standoff at all costs, and if he couldn't, he was certainly going to make it a painful experience for Nikolai. But, pain or not, Nikolai also wanted to win this war that had now become one of the government force versus allegiance to God. Nikolai did work some on Wednesday, and then a full day on Thursday and Friday. By now he was beginning to get some real looks from the other prisoners. Everyone knew he was completely devoted to his God, but Nikolai was sure many of them had no real idea what sitting in a wooden box for 10 days at a time had to do with it. Was he a religious fanatic? A lunatic? Was he a political prisoner just trying to make a political statement? Sooner or later, Nikolai knew he was going to get an opportunity to share his story. Sooner or later, someone would come asking, and Nikolai would get a chance to tell them why he was so devoted to serving his God. But for now, the others just watched and wondered at Nikolai's vigilant faith. And when the Sabbath day arrived, things turned out exactly as Nikolai knew they would. He was put back in the box. It amazed him that the warden was sticking to this strategy of discipline. Every time he put Nikolai in the box, Nikolai was out of commission for 10 days, and then it took at least a day for him to recover to recoup his strength. That left him only 2 days to resume work again before being put back into the box. If the warden wanted to run an efficient camp, locking Nikolai up for such lengthy periods of time wasn't working. At least not if he wanted to get any work out of Nikolai. The whole thing didn't make much sense. But the whole strategy of the Soviet government didn't make much sense neither. Why force a person or a group of people to give up something they cherished? The whole thing was just like trying to force a man to turn against his own family. But of course, the prison warden wouldn't care about that. He had no religion. He would never comprehend the strength of Nikolai's allegiance to his God and his church family. If he never would have persisted in fighting against Nikolai's incredible, immovable devotion to the service of his God. And so it went. As the short summer weeks turned into a chill of autumn, frost came in August, and then a light snowy in early September. While in the box, Nikolai could not afford to sleep for very long periods of time. Every few minutes he had to wake up and move his legs and arms so he could keep the circulation going. When the frigid days of winter came in late October, Nikolai worried. How would he stay alive? How would he manage to stay warm, all cooped up in a small box? Nikolai wasn't sure it really mattered anymore. If he perished, he perished. If it was time for him to lay down his life for Jesus, then he was at peace with such a fate. But just as he resigned, as he was to the possibility, he was just as sure that God had a plan for his life. Something in store for him as God's witness, though, to be in a box. It was times like this that the scriptures became Nikolai's greatest comfort. His favorite passage were Psalms 23, 91, and 140. These wonderful psalms helped him focus on real battle that was raging, the battle between good and evil. Yuri must have been feeling sorry for Nikolai again, because one morning when he brought the preacher man to bread and water, he also brought 2 thick blankets. It had been an especially cold night, and the gesture warmed Nikolai's heart with gratefulness to Yuri and God. The blankets wouldn't keep him toasty, but they would take the edge off the cold winter nights. All the water in the camp was freezing over by now. Even the barrels of water brought from the spring on a daily basis would freeze by morning. During the early days of the winter, Petya, the cook, would bring the thick sheet of ice at the top of each barrel in the mornings. But when the real temperatures of winter settled in and dropped to 0 and below, the water froze solid in a matter of hours. Petya began having Oleg bring the barrels inside the kitchen. Because of this extreme temperature, Nikolai knew he couldn't afford to let the water get chilled. If he allowed the water to start to freeze, it would drop his body temperature even further when he drank it. From now on, he knew he would have to drink it right away when Yuri brought it to him, when Yuri brought his can of water. The hours of daylight were few now, and the nights longer. Nikolai's breath made puffs of steam when he breathed, and when he pulled the blanket up around his face, a crust of frost quickly gathered. How he managed to stay warm in the ice-cold temperature he never knew. But one thing was for sure, with God, all things are possible. He was Nikolai's ever-present help in trouble. Chapter 18. Late one afternoon, Yuri came into the stable quite unexpectedly. He pushed and pulled Nikolai's wooden crate to a dark corner of the stable, away from the doorway and the chilly winds that sometimes blew in when the door was open. Nikolai was surprised at the ease with which Yuri moved the box, but then he realized that he was not the stout man he once was. Even through his coat, he could feel his ribs. When Yuri began forking hay up around the crate, Nikolai's heart was touched. The hay would do wonders to insulate him against the cold winter air. Now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he knew the guard really did care what happened to him. "Thank you," was all Nikolai said, but the two of them knew what such a gesture could truly mean to Nikolai. It would very likely save his life. Nikolai was sure that Yuri was acting on his own, and that the warden knew nothing of Yuri's thoughtful deeds. The food he had brought, the water, the blankets, and the hay he piled high around his box, all were simple acts of kindness, and yet ones that couldn't be misconstrued. The cold days of winter turned to a wet spring. Unable to move about in the box, he was imprisoned there. The damp air chilled Nikolai to the bone. He wasn't sure which was worse, the frigid, mid-numbing days of winter, or the wet, bone-chilling days of spring. When summer finally came, and his 10-day confinement in the crate continued, the insects returned, and so did the memories of his first day in the box. Again, his skin swelled up from the bites of mosquitoes, black flies, and the no-see-ums. Surprisingly, in spite of the moderate temperatures outside, many days in the stable under the tin roof turned oppressively warm. This brought problems again with cleanliness, since Nikolai was not allowed out of the box to go to the bathroom, and of course this just made the fly problem even worse. All that summer, Nikolai had endured the sessions of being confined in a wooden box. All that summer, he wouldn't approach the Sabbath with stubborn he would approach the Sabbath with stubborn faithfulness and the tenacity that impressed even the warden. If Nikolai could have seen how it really affected the warden, he would have been greatly encouraged. Nevertheless, the warden would not give in, and back Nikolai would go to the box each Sabbath. He would endure his 10-day sentence, be released, then suffer great anguish as he worked to regain the use of his legs. Then he would spend a couple of days working with Vadim on camp repairs and projects before being locked up again in the box. As fall arrived, and once again stretched into winter, Nikolai became known as the preacher in the box. He hated to think that his time in the box was being wasted, and some days he had to wonder what in the world God's long-range plan might be. He had heard of saints who suffered in prison for 20, 30 years, and he dreaded the possibility of such a fate. But even that didn't seem to deter him much anymore. It seemed to be a part of Nikolai's routine now, part of who he was and who he had become. Most days he wasn't sure which would be better, to live another day or to suffer the slow painful deterioration of his body through such torture, or experience a quick death that would end his earthly life. But again, it didn't really matter. Hadn't his life already been one long trial of persecution for the sake of the gospel? Why question God's plan now? Nikolai truly did trust his heavenly Father. Someday, all would be clear. In the meantime, he tried not to ask too many philosophical questions about the quality of life or about God's overall plan for him. He just kept quoting scriptures that promised answers someday. This gave him simple strength to endure for yet another day. All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. He would recite to himself countless times while in the box. All the verses he had memorized in his life were coming back to him now, and they were a real source of comfort in his time of need. Do not fear any of those things that you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into a prison, that you may be tested, and that you may have tribulation 10 days. Revelations 2:10. This part of the verse always made Nikolai smile ironically. He knew the verse was more symbolic than literal, but still it was satisfying to think that John, the Revelator, had used the very number of days in the prophecy that matched the number of days Nikolai was having to suffer each time in the box. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. That was the part of the passage that always gave him the greatest hope. It reminded him that nothing really mattered in life except that he remained faithful to Jesus. And so to witness for God in a communist prison, truly a privilege. As far as Nikolai could tell, there were no Christians in the camp. He could hardly believe that, but as one yet, none had shown their true colors or dared come forward, even if it just to encourage him. But if his witness for Jesus could bring even one soul to Christ, he felt it would be worth it. All the pain and hardship he had endured would stand for something. It would not be for nothing. And who knew? If one man were brought to Jesus, maybe others would follow. Another cold winter followed in the heels of autumn, and the spring edged its way into camp. One spring day, when Nikolai was once again pulled from the box, he lay there in the straw looking throughout the stable doorway. The month of May had come, and although this time of the year was still quite cool, the sunshine and clear blue sky warmed his heart. As Nikolai slowly flexed his legs, trying to get the kinks out of his knees, He thanked God for life. He thanked Jesus for the chance to be a living witness for him instead of being a martyr. It was amazing that he could endure such hardship and not resent the leading of his heavenly Father. But it was famous lines from Scripture that always kept him upbeat in his attitude toward life. One of his favorites was from the writings of Paul. For I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Philippians 4:11. And that, of course, was what always made the difference. How could it not? Nikolai had given his life totally to God, and God was giving him just what he needed day by day until the time was right to reveal the next phase of his divine plan. Chapter 19. A few weeks later, unusual guests showed up at the prison camp. 3 military officers rode in on horses, and it was obvious by their appearance that one of them was a high-ranking colonel in the army, all the way from the Nizhny Novgorod. It soon became clear that they were there to inspect the camp. The warden pulled out all the stops and made quite a show of things. Not that he had anything remarkable to brag about at the prison camp. It was a standard camp out in the middle of nowhere on the Siberian steppes, housing some 300 prisoners, with no notorious or political criminals among them. But guests at the camp were rare, so giving these special visitors a tour was the biggest thing that had happened at the camp in years. They were shown the officers' quarters, the kitchen and the mess hall and the barracks. Nikolai could hear their conversation as they took the tour near the stables. "What's in here?" the colonel asked, pointing at the low-roofed shed where Nikolai's box was kept. The warden glanced through the open doorway of the stable. He had put Nikolai in a box just 3 days ago, but he had hoped to avoid having to explain the situation to the colonel. "Oh, this is where we house the worst prisoners," he said nonchalantly. "Severe punishment keeps the insubordinate ones under control." "What types of punishments?" "Oh, various types," the warden squirmed. The officer stepped through the doorway and peered into the dim shadows of the stable. "We keep them locked up in boxes like that one." The warden pointed at Nikolai's wooden crate in the corner. "How many prisoners are locked up right now?" The officer was painfully persistent, and Nikolai could sense the uneasiness in the warden's voice. "Well, we have only one man in here right now." "And he's in for what specifically?" "For refusing to carry out his duties." The officer stepped closer to the wooden crate, but immediately stepped back as his nose caught a whiff of the foul stench coming from the crate. "Phew!" he exclaimed. "And how long have you been punishing him for this sort of insubordination?" The warden scratched his head. "Only 3 days this time so far, but he's in for a 10-day stint." "A 10-day stint?" The colonel looked skeptical. "And you say he won't work? How many times has he been insubordinate?" "Well, now, he's been giving us trouble ever since he arrived at the camp." The warden's eyes darted back and forth between the box and the colonel. "Every time we let him out, he disobeys again, so we just put him back in the box." The colonel looked at the box again. "And you've tried how many times?" I'm guessing we would be doing it pretty close to 2 years now." The colonel looked at the warden incredulously, his mouth dropping open in disbelief. Through the cracks in the crate, Nikolai watched the whole thing transpire, and with bated breath he waited for the conversation to continue. It was becoming more and more apparent that the colonel did not approve of such crude forms of treatment, and it also appeared as though the warden was about to get reprimanded for it. 2 years? "Yes, sir." "You've had this man locked up in a tiny box for 10-day stints repeatedly during the past 2 years?" That must be some 40 or 50 times at least. The warden looked embarrassed. He paused, and then finally replied, "Well, yes, I'd say that's about right." "Do you mean to tell me that you've been locking this man up in a crate for 2 years and it hasn't done any good? That even with this type of punishment, he's still being disobedient or insubordinate or whatever you want to call it?" The colonel was getting more irritated by the minute. "Did it ever occur to you, officer, that there may be a good reason this man isn't following your orders? I mean, 2 years and he still hasn't come around?" The warden looked shocked and bewildered and aghast all at the same instant. "Well, did you?" No, sir. It didn't occur to me just like that, but now that you put it that way, it does sound pretty ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" The colonel almost shouted. "I'll say it sounds ridiculous. Total idiotic if you ask me. In fact, I'm beginning to question who the intelligent one is around here. Certainly not you." He continued to glare at the warden. "I ought to have your commission revoked for running such an operation. This isn't discipline, it's plain torture. We Russian officers may be tough and mean as wildcats, but we're not animals." No, right? We're right here at the end of chapter 19. We'll be going into 20 in the next reading, but just like a movie, to be continued. It puts you in such suspense to know what is going to happen next and how wonderful God is. Oh, is he not wonderful? Oh, I love this book. I love this story. And you see that this is a turn of events for the inspection to come in, and this military officer, colonel, whatever he is, comes in and just is flabbergasted by the cruelty of this warden. I love it. God is so good. And until next time, we will see you next time, and we'll go into chapter 20 on the miracle of the seventh day ox, and I will see you again then. God bless. Have a blessed day. Bye.